Hi, I'm Belkin again, and this is the third lesson in the online Modern Harmony course. Today's lesson is about added notes. Added notes are a simple way to take third-based harmony, fairly straightforward third-based harmony, to add color to it while still keeping it coherent. As we go along, we're going to be discussing more complex ways of doing this, but for today, added notes are a good start, as you will see. The definition of an added note is simply adding an occasional second within a third-based sonority. Simple example would be a C major triad, and I add a sixth above that. So when you're using added notes, it's important that the underlying harmonies be quite simple. If you take a chord like this, and I add another second, we can't really say that it sounds like something added on the basic thing. We have a cluster there. I need something that's quite simple, like the triad, and there if I add 1 second, it doesn't completely destroy the character of the original chord. That's why for added notes, it's best to only use one at a time. If you use more than one added note, in other words, adding 2 or 3 or more seconds in a chord, you quickly end up with a cluster or some kind of clotted harmony, and it becomes very, very heavy. The result of adding too many seconds is a kind of inertia. You feel so many dissonances that you have no sense anymore of where it wants to go. And the result of that is it paralyzes the musical movement. Now you'll notice that in the example that I gave, the C major chord with the added A, that chord, C, E, G, A, could be seen as a 7th chord, A, C, E, G, in first inversion. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that in the case that I just gave, it's by itself. It's not acting like an A7 chord. It's acting like a C major chord. And as you'll see in the progression, it's used like a C major chord. This brings up an important point. In this class and in the next few, we're going to be talking about chords that sometimes could fall into various different categories. You can't tell from the chord by itself. It's the context that's going to tell you which it is. So for example, in some cases, if you just look at the chord by itself, it could be a 7th chord or it could be an added note. You won't know until you see how they're used, and you will see how that happens in a second. Okay? So in a general way, we can say that added notes act like color modifiers rather than changing the direction. We'll get back to that in a second. You can also see that because of the added second, they integrate pretty well with 7th chords, 9th chords, 11ths, etc. because of the seconds. Think of a C major 9th. If I play C major and I add the 9th, by itself, that could just be an added note. Same thing is true with an 11th, with 11th, or a 13th. These chords integrate well with 7th, 9th, and 11th chords because of the second component. In fact, if I take a C major chord and add a 9th on top of it, there's really no way to tell without the context if this is really a 9th or an added note. If it's a real 9th, it'll resolve. If it's an added note, it'll just stay there and not move on with any kind of resolution. But the second component does mean that it's possible to use these added note chords in the same situation as 7ths and 9ths and 11ths without them sounding out of context. An added note can be used as a climax, it can be used as a cadence, even in a non-added note context, since they will stand out. Let's look at example 1. So if we look at example 1, we can see that it starts off with an F major chord, goes to D minor, then there's a 5-7 to B flat, which goes to B flat. All those are normal tonal chords. The bass leaps down to make a 7th chord on G. Then we go to C minor chord with a double suspension. If I take away the suspension, here's the result. With the suspension, normal resolution for that would be, but here we used, but as you can see, since there are 7th chords in here already with dissonances, like this, and the suspensions here, the added note at the end doesn't sound out of place. The only thing is, since it's an added note, it doesn't have to resolve. In a normal tonal context, that G would eventually fall to an F. Here I might go on to something else and not resolve it at all. But that's a simple classical example of an added note. Okay, now if you think about it, you'll see that given that the context is the only difference between, say, a 7th chord and an added note chord, you can have both happening in the same phrase. For example, if we look at example 2, in this case, we start off with an inversion of a 6-7 in G major. That's the 6th degree 7th chord. Then we go to a 2-7. Then we go to a 5-7. So all those are normal progressions going through the circle of fifths, and each seventh is resolving. The difference is the last chord. The last chord is a G major chord with an E inside it. But that E doesn't have to resolve. So if we look at the beginning, that's actually the same chord, just a slightly different position. Instead of this, I have this. It's the same chord. However, the first time we hear it in bar 1, it resolves normally to the 7th goes down like that. Then the 7 in this chord goes down to this one. And the 7th in this chord goes down there. This is the note that's the added note. So here we see an example of the same chord being used both as a regular 7th chord and as an added note. That can happen sometimes. It's not uncommon. Again, you can see how this kind of technique integrates quite well into fairly rich harmony without sounding like anything very strange. Okay, another example we can see is example 3. In example 3, we have a couple of unusual sonorities. In the first bar of example 3, we have what we called last time, what we called in the linear chord lesson, a sort of big neighbor note. So that second chord on the second beat of the first bar is just acting like a neighbor chord, the bass going like that. Now in the next bar, things change. Then we go, okay, that's like a 9th chord. The 9th chord resolves down like a great big appoggiatura. Now the resolution we're expecting is this. That would be like in Phrygian mode. However, what we get is, has that second on top. So that adds extra color to the chord, and that, in fact, is an added note. Again, notice that I'm using the added note in a place where it doesn't necessarily have to be resolved. So we can combine different kinds of dissonance. Linear dissonance and added notes also tend to combine quite well. Okay, another example. This is the chord now, the specific one that Messiaen calls a resonance note. Let's listen to example 4. If we look at example 4, we'll see several added note chords. The chord on the last beat of the first bar, that's this one. Okay, the first beat we had this, now we have this. Now normally that would be an F major chord, but I have a G in the middle. That G is the added note, and it doesn't resolve anywhere. Then we go to, so that's like a C major chord, but with an F sharp. That's why Messiaen calls it a resonance note, because in the harmonic series of C, that note comes fairly soon. So it's like a harmonic note. Again, that note does not resolve. Normal resolution, if I wanted to resolve it, would be like an appoggiatura. Here we get, so there's no resolution. We just go on. So the color in the phrase comes from those two added notes. First one here, second one here. Now look at the cadence. The cadence has a similar dissonance, but it resolves. There's that 7th, the D at the end, and it resolves to a C. So that here allows me to use a 7th chord as a cadence. You could see that 7th chord as an E flat minor chord with an added 6th, or as an inverted 7th. We can't really know unless it goes on. But the important thing is those chords in measure 1 and 2 definitely do not resolve. They fit together. One more point about this. Notice that the bass at the beginning is in parallel fifths. Well, a lot of you have had harmony classes and been told you're not supposed to do that, parallel fifths. The point about parallel fifths is not that they are mortal sin, it's that they stand out. So if you're going to use them, you have to use them in a way that makes sense. Well, here the fact that the whole beginning of the phrase is with those parallel fifths, notice that the cadence, that we change that that chord at the end of bar 2 announces that something different is happening, and it's a good way to let us know the cadence is on the way. So again, that kind of thing, if something is consistent in the texture, almost anything can work that way, provided you're coherent in the way you deal with it. In this case, the cadence changes the texture in a way that's appropriate for the punctuation. And the added notes give color to the phrase. And they also integrate with that last chord, which could be an added note or a seventh chord. We won't really know unless we had a follow-up, which we don't at this point. Now we need to go on a little farther. Once you add added notes, these added dissonances, into standard harmonies or standard harmonic progressions, they can easily clog up the harmony, and specifically what they can do is they can make the harmonic direction unclear if you're not careful. This underlines once again the importance of having a really clearly directed, solid bass line. The bass line is going to help us make the direction clear, okay? And then the added notes, as a result, will not take away from the overall drive of the phrase. Let's look at example 5a. I'm going to play example 5a now, first of all, without the added notes. I'm going to play the whole phrase, but leaving out the added notes. So we can hear a pretty standard tonal progression. That's an A minor chord, going to an augmented sixth chord, then going back, then again augmented sixth, then again A minor, then augmented sixth, goes to a slightly different augmented sixth, and then finally resolves onto the dominant. So the bass line is a very standard tonal progression here, basically moving from 1 down to 5 via the augmented sixth. Now I add the added notes. What they do is they add accent to those chords on the augmented sixth. If you listen to it the first way, already the augmented sixth is sort of a color because of that E flat. When I add the D inside it, that D adds a much stronger color to it. Well, up to this point, we don't really know what it's doing, but then it goes back to the same thing again, and once more, and then after that we do, so it seems now like the D is resolving to C, like in a appoggiatura, and if we stop there, that in fact would be the case, but, so here again we have a chord which has a crunch in the middle. That crunch is again the added note. So this is an augmented sixth chord with an added note, then resolves onto the dominant seventh. Notice that the dominant seventh makes a good cadence here because it's less tense than the added note chords. So the added notes in this case are added onto an already complex chord. That complex chord creates an accent. The added notes make the accent stronger, and when the resolution comes, it comes onto a chord that's dissonant but gentler. So that gives the phrase its shape. And it's important that the bass line A, F, A, F, A, F, E is a very straightforward and well-directed bass line. So that's an example of using added notes as a way to sort of increase the force, let's say, of an augmented sixth chord. Augmented sixth chords are good chords because they have strong direction. The added note just makes them punchier. So that's example 5a. If we use added notes, let's say with dominant sevenths, as in example 5b, you see it's just a way to sort of strengthen the color. In this case, we can see that this is just a 1-5-1 in C major. The only thing is that normally I wouldn't do this. I would do this. However, here, now you can see that added note, the C sharp, is not resolved, but it still sounds like a dominant chord. So it still sounds like a 1-5-1, but with a sort of extra colorful sound. So that's pretty typical for added notes, and you can see how they can be used with conventional chords like dominant seventh chords, augmented sixth chords, and so on. The harmonic progression in both cases, however, is very, very simple and clear.